A search was launched that night. And then, what the rescue team found the next morning stunned everyone. A circle of massive grizzlies stood watch around his unconscious body, and whatever had happened in the hours before the rescue team arrived would shake the foundations of what scientists thought they knew about wild instinct. Luke Brennan was no ordinary ranger. Known for his steady hands and razor-sharp instincts, he was a familiar figure along Trail 17. Every morning, long before the sun crept over the horizon, he'd set off alone on a familiar route through the rugged terrain of Bitterroot National Forest. That morning was supposed to be no different. Just a simple check of a few trail cameras, make sure the path was safe, and be back before nightfall. But as the sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy, fate was already scribbling a very different script. His truck rumbled gently as he eased it down the narrow, winding path. The cold mountain air slapped against his cheeks when he pulled over near a rough trailhead. Slinging his backpack over one shoulder, radio crackling faintly with static, Luke began his hike. The forest was wrapped in an eerie stillness. Only the soft whisper of wind through towering pines broke the silence. Then, on a lonely stretch of trail that felt almost too quiet, everything changed. Without warning, his boots slipped on a thin layer of frost covering the hard ground. One moment he was upright, the next he was tumbling down a slope, crashing through low branches and jagged rocks. His cry was swallowed by the wind rushing through the trees. When his body finally came to a stop, it landed on a bed of dry pine needles and loose stone, as if the forest itself had caught him. Pain exploded in his shoulder and head. His radio, that faithful lifeline, now lay silent and broken beside him. Luke was unconscious, lost to the world around him. Hours passed in a haze of silence, until the pale light of dawn began to filter through the thick canopy above. When the search team, led by fellow ranger Aaron Miller, finally traced his location, they found Luke face down at the edge of Trail 17. His uniform was shredded, his face pale as if all life had drained from it. But what stopped everyone in their tracks wasn't the condition he was in. It was what surrounded him. A wide ring of grizzly bears had gathered in total silence. The scene had an almost surreal quality to it. Towering, wild, majestic creatures stood motionless, like statues. Their eyes, deep, dark, ancient, held something raw and timeless, as if they carried the very soul of the forest within them. Forming a loose semicircle around Luke's unconscious body, their heavy breaths clouded in the cold morning air. One older bear, clearly aged with a silvered muzzle and a slow, deliberate gait, stepped forward. Its eyes locked onto Luke with an intensity that was startling in a wild animal. Officer Miller, hands trembling with fear, could do nothing but stand frozen. He tried to recall his training, the drills, the bear encounter protocols. But nothing had prepared him for this. Wild animals not attacking, but standing guard over an injured human. The old bear shifted its weight and let out a low, steady growl that echoed softly through the unnervingly still forest. Younger bears, maybe curious cubs, moved slightly closer, their steps cautious and slow. In that hushed moment, the line between human and nature blurred. No one knew how long the grizzlies had been there. The team speculated they might have been drawn by the scent of blood, or perhaps by some primal instinct to protect the fallen. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath as the bears continued to stand vigil. Though Luke lay unconscious, the bears showed no aggression. They didn't lunge or roar. Instead, they seemed to shield him, almost as if they were keeping him safe. Officer Miller, his voice barely above a whisper, said, "They're not attacking, they're protecting him." The words drifted into the air beneath the heavy pine branches, and in that moment the search party felt a powerful blend of awe, fear, and gratitude. As the morning light grew stronger, the bears slowly retreated back into the forest, leaving behind only a silent promise that, in its own mysterious way, the wilderness sometimes looks after its own. When Luke finally came to, blinking at a world now somehow more brutal and more compassionate, he could barely remember what had happened. The rescue team gently carried him to safety, unaware that this baffling encounter was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the bond between humans and the wild. The morning after Luke's rescue, Ranger Erin Miller sat alone in the observation tower, eyes fixed on the security feed from Trail 17. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from memory. What she had witnessed the day before hadn't just confused her. It had changed her. At least 5 bears, 4 younger ones, 1 older. Not a single one attacked. Not a single one showed fear. They circled Luke's body like sentries, unmoving even as people approached. It didn't make sense. Not by the book. Not by science. Not by anything she had learned in over a decade out here. Back at the ranger station, Luke Brennan was awake. Bruised, battered, with stitches lining his right shoulder, but alive. He sat on the bed under the soft hum of fluorescent lights, staring at his hands. He couldn't recall the exact moment he fell. There was only a vague memory of cold, darkness. Then, something warm, silent. But there had been a presence. Massive, breathing. He kept telling himself it must have been a dream. But Erin's voice at the door told a different story. "You were surrounded," she said. "They didn't leave you." Luke blinked. "What?" "Bears," she said gently. "Grizzlies. They formed a circle around you until we got there. They didn't try to hurt you. One even stepped between us and your body when we arrived." He looked at her, waiting for a crooked smile, a joke. Nothing came. She placed a small flash drive on the table beside him. Trailcam caught part of it. By that afternoon, the footage had made its way through every ranger's inbox and up the chain to Montana Wildlife Authority. The video was grainy but clear enough, a massive grizzly stepping out from behind a tree, sniffing the air, then lying down beside Luke's motionless body. 2 younger bears wandered nearby, then stopped, calm, watchful. The old bear shifted position when Erin's flashlight beam entered the frame. That moment, just before the cubs began to retreat, etched itself into the minds of everyone who saw it. The bear looked straight into the camera. No panic, no fear, but purpose. The story didn't stay quiet for long. Within 48 hours, it had leaked to a local outdoor blog, then a wildlife site, then national news. Headlines blared, "Grizzlies guard ranger in Montana wilderness, miracle on Trail 17, bears or guardians." Reporters called it unbelievable. Experts offered no definitive explanation. But for those who were there, who saw it with their own eyes, this wasn't just a story. It was something else entirely. That night, as Luke tried to sleep, fragments of memory began to surface, brief, disjointed flashes, the warm brush of thick fur against his hip. The soft rasp of breath near his ear, the heavy weight of a massive body pressed close, shielding him from the bitter cold, and then a long, deep exhale. Not a growl, more like a sigh, heavy, worn. Luke jolted upright, heart pounding. This wasn't just a rescue, it was intentional. Technically, Luke wasn't allowed back on Trail 17. He was still on medical leave, shoulder not yet fully healed. The Wildlife Authority had ordered a full report, a psychological evaluation, and strict restrictions against entering high-risk zones. But something deep in those woods called to him, louder than any regulation. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't pride. It was unfinished business. So, one crisp early morning, 3 weeks after the fall that nearly killed him, Luke quietly packed a light bag, borrowed a patrol vehicle without signing it out, and drove alone into the forest. The woods hadn't changed, cold, vast, unknowable. But they felt different now, not exactly dangerous, not exactly safe. Awake, like the forest itself was watching. Branches seemed to lean closer. Each gust of wind whispered old, forgotten memories. He returned to the very curve where his boots had once slipped. The slope was just as steep, the thin layer of ice still clinging stubbornly to the trail. A new wooden sign had been posted nearby, "Caution, unstable trail, do not enter." Luke ignored it. He moved slowly, cautiously, and when he reached the spot where they had found him, a shallow dip in the terrain, bushes flattened, he stopped. The clearing was silent, eerily still. No sign of struggle, no blood, no footprints. But something else caught his eye. Just to his right, etched deep into the soft bark of a birch tree, were claw marks, 3 long, deliberate lines. Not the panicked scrape of an animal in distress. Too precise, too intentional. They weren't fresh, but not old either. Luke stepped closer and placed his hand over them. They were almost the same width as the old grizzly's paw, and they pointed inward, straight toward the patch of earth where he had once lain, as if marking the spot, a sign, or maybe a warning. He turned to leave, then froze. At the edge of the slope above the clearing, no more than 50 feet away, stood a solitary figure, a bear cub, smaller than the adults he remembered, lighter in color, wide eyes, unmoving, watching, just watching. Luke held his breath, not out of fear, but recognition. It was one of the cubs from that day, now older, but unmistakable. They stared at each other in silence. Seconds stretched, heavy with something sacred. Then the cub stepped forward. One small step, then sat down. No aggression, no fear, just presence, as if to say, "I remember." Luke slowly reached into his coat and pulled out a granola bar, not to feed the bear, not as bait, just something placed between them, a small gesture of connection. He knelt, gently set the bar on a flat stone, and backed away. The cub didn't move, didn't react, but its head tilted slightly, its breath misted in the cold air, and in that moment Luke felt it again. The same weight, the same calm he'd known that night, when thick fur had pressed against his side, when soft breaths slowed his racing heart, when a wild creature chose not to end his life, but to shield it. He left the clearing without a word, quiet and utterly changed. The next time Luke returned, he brought something different. Not food, not equipment, something older than both. A small leather pouch, weathered, faded, bound with a simple sinew cord. Inside was a tiny bell. The bell had once been part of a collar fitted to a bear cub, tranquilized and rescued from poachers 2 years earlier. The rewilding mission had failed, and the collar had been abandoned. But Luke remembered that bear. He remembered its eyes, wild, yes, but not angry, just lost. Alone. The cub never came back. But somehow, it no longer felt like something disconnected. It felt linked, connected. Luke returned to the same slope, the same bend where he'd first locked eyes with the young bear. This time, the air was colder. The forest was soaked with meltwater and scattered patches of lingering snow. Branches drooped under the weight of wetness and silence. Every step Luke took seemed deliberate, measured. And when he reached the familiar clearing, he saw the flat stone, the very one where he'd left the granola bar days ago. It was gone, but in its place, a pine cone, neatly set, centered, as if placed there by someone or something with intention. Luke blinked slowly, stepped closer. He knew this wasn't random. He knelt, took out the leather pouch and placed it exactly where the pine cone had rested. He said nothing, expected nothing. But his heart pounded like a war drum. He sat beneath a nearby tree and waited, for over an hour, just listening, just watching. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. It was alert, and then, just as the sunset painted the treetops gold, the bear cub appeared. Same slope, same legs. But this time, no hesitation. It stepped forward. Slow, heavy, deliberate. It approached the stone, sniffed the pouch, nudged it once with its nose, then looked directly at Luke. Not to ask permission, but to be acknowledged. Then it sat down and stayed. For 20 silent minutes, man and bear. Just breathing in the same deep woods air. Eventually, the cub rose, turned, and slipped back into the trees. The pouch remained on the stone, unmoved, but not rejected. It had been accepted. Luke kept returning in the days that followed. He never brought food, never carried a camera, only himself. Sometimes the cub appeared, sometimes it didn't. But always, the pouch remained where he'd left it. Occasionally, it had been moved. Once, it was covered with leaves. Another time, it was encircled by smooth, flat stones, arranged in a perfect ring. Luke never told anyone about this. He couldn't, because what he was part of now wasn't science. It was ritual, a wordless conversation, and then, on the 5th return, something changed. The air was heavier, and from deep in the forest, there was movement. Slow, silent, but unmistakable. A bear stepped out, then another, much larger. Darker fur, a scar stretched along her muzzle, unmistakable. The mother bear, the one from that night. She stood quietly behind the cub. No growl, no charge, just watching, as if the entire forest held its breath with her. The young bear moved to the stone, nudged the pouch, then turned to glance back at her. But the mother didn't react. Her gaze never left Luke, unwavering. Luke slowly rose, took a step back, then placed his hand on his chest. Not for show, but because it hurt, as if his heart understood something before his mind could catch up. And in her eyes, he knew. This wasn't about territory anymore, not about instinct or curiosity. This was memory, something passed down, held, honored. And somehow, Luke had become part of it. He moved more quietly now, walked more slowly. Still lived in the same old cabin on the park's edge. Still wore the uniform when duty called. But his heart no longer belonged to maps or budget meetings. It lived in the forest now, somewhere between the claw marks on the birch and the leather pouch on the stone. He didn't speak of it anymore. Not even to Erin, who had been there since the beginning. She too had fallen silent. But in places like Madison County, Stories don't stay buried long, and eventually the wrong person heard the right rumor at just the right time. Dr. Micah Ward was a young biologist from Missoula, ambitious, sharp, and with more field experience than many tenured academics. The year before, he'd made waves with a paper on cognitive empathy in apex predators, particularly grizzlies. So when he heard whispers of a ranger who'd been protected by wild bears and who kept returning to meet them, Ward couldn't resist the pull. He made a few calls, got a name, traced the path into the forest, and then, unannounced, he showed up. That Tuesday morning, as light filtered faintly through the trees, Luke heard a second set of footsteps on the damp forest floor. He had just placed a small stone beside the leather pouch, a simple gesture, nothing more, when he turned and saw a figure stepping into the clearing. Windbreaker, camera slung around his neck. Luke's heart sank. "This isn't a place you should be," he said, voice calm but firm. The man didn't hesitate. "I had to see it for myself. I'm Dr. Ward, from the university." Luke didn't invite him, but he didn't send him away either, and Ward knew that was enough. Luke glanced around the woods, sensing it immediately, the shift in the air, a quiet alertness spreading through the trees like the forest itself was listening. The silence wasn't peace anymore. It was thick with meaning. And then it happened. A flicker of movement on the slope. The young bear emerged first, but this time it wasn't alone. Behind it, the scar-muzzled mother stepped into the light, her presence calm, but unmistakably commanding. No aggression, no fear, just presence. Both stood, watching. Luke whispered, "Don't move. Don't take a photo." But it was too late. Ward had already raised the camera. Click. The sound was small but piercing. Everything froze. The mother bear shifted, stepping between her cub and the two men. The cub exhaled. Not a growl, but a low, pointed sound. A warning. Luke stepped forward, placing himself slightly between Ward and the bears. Then, in a voice like mist, he said, "It's all right. We're not here to take anything, only to give something back." He knelt, touched the leather pouch once more, as if reaffirming that truth, then stepped back. The mother watched him, eyes deep and unreadable. And after a long moment, she turned. The cub followed. Together, they melted into the trees like morning fog. Ward stood frozen, then exhaled, like someone surfacing from a world underwater. "My God," he whispered. "That wasn't fear. That wasn't wild instinct." He stammered. "That was a choice," Luke finished, his eyes steady on Ward's. "I need to document this," Ward said. Luke only shook his head. "No." Ward looked stunned. This could change everything. Luke's gaze softened, but his words were steel. "Exactly." That evening, they sat across from each other in Luke's old cabin. Ward held the memory card in his hand. 3 perfect photos. Unmistakable proof. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the wind moved gently through the branches, like breath. Ward stared at the flames, card still in hand. "You really believe they remember?" he asked. Luke nodded. "I believe they never forgot." Ward looked down, then, without another word, leaned forward and set the card into the fire. No one spoke in that moment, but the message was clear as wind through the trees. Some truths aren't meant to be revealed. The first storm of the season came not with window-rattling thunder, but with a deep, rolling growl. the kind that reverberated through your ribs and warned that something was coming. All week, Luke had noticed the signs. Snow melting faster than usual, rivers swelling, stretches of Trail 17 flooding in places that hadn't seen water in years. But it wasn't the rising water that worried him. It was the lives that moved within the forest. He laced up his boots just as the first bolt of lightning split the horizon. No gun, no radio, just instinct and a length of rope. By the time he reached the high ridge near the old junction above Miner's Hollow, the rain was pouring in sheets and the familiar creek had turned into a raging torrent. And then, downriver, he saw it. A flash of brown spinning in the current, small, desperate, fighting. It was her, the young bear, no longer a tiny cub but still far too small to survive this flood. She was being swept downstream, slammed against a jammed log acting like a makeshift dam. Luke didn't think. He ran. Sliding down the muddy bank, heart pounding, breath ragged, he reached the water's edge. The current nearly ripped his footing out from under him, but he moved forward, tying one end of the rope around a pine trunk, the other looped around his own body. And he jumped. The cold hit him like a hammer to the chest, turning his limbs to stone. The current flipped him, spun him, dragged him. But he clawed forward, kicking, thrashing, closing the gap. She clung to the log, eyes wide with panic and spray, but she didn't fight. She just watched him. When Luke reached her, she let him slip an arm around her shoulder. He gripped the rope and shouted, not in fear, but in defiance. Not today. Not me. The river fought, but Luke fought harder, inch by inch, until his feet found rock, until they both crawled their way back onto the bank. And there they lay, man and bear, soaked, trembling, wordless, just breathing, just surviving. When he finally looked up, she was there, the mother bear. At the ridge above, rain cascading down her fur. She didn't move forward, didn't growl. She simply watched. Her breath misted into the stormy air, and Luke knew she had seen everything. Slowly, he stood, pulling the young bear upright beside him. She leaned into him, as if her bones had decided to trust. Together, they climbed, and when they reached solid ground, the mother bear was gone. That night, Luke didn't return to his cabin. He stayed at the old ranger station, built a roaring fire, and sat beside its flickering light through the dark. The young bear curled up beneath the eaves, just outside the open doorway. Not inside, but close enough to feel the warmth of the fire, and of him. She wasn't afraid. She didn't flee. She just slept, deep and peaceful, as if she knew she was safe, as if she knew she had survived. By dawn, the rain had finally ended. Luke opened the door wide. She stood, glanced at him once, then slowly turned and walked back into the forest. Quiet, strong, free. That summer came late. The snow lingered, leaving the trails heavy and breathless, like the forest itself was waking from a long dream. Luke walked them one last time. Not as a ranger, but as someone preparing to leave the only place that had ever truly felt like home. Weeks earlier, he had submitted his resignation. No announcement, no farewell party, just a signature and a set of keys left neatly on the duty desk. People in town whispered that Luke changed. They weren't wrong, but they didn't know the half of it. Some stories aren't meant for the news. Some truths are meant to stay in the woods, where no one asks for explanations. On his final day, Luke left the old cabin with only a backpack, a worn leather journal, and the same small pouch that had been part of a silent ritual for months. He hadn't planned to stop at the clearing off Trail 17, but his feet carried him there anyway. Muscle memory, now written into bone. When he reached the stone where he'd once placed the pouch, he saw something had changed. Not the trees, not the sounds, not the dappled light of a path he knew by heart. It was what waited on the stone. 12 river stones, arranged in a perfect circle. In the center, a cracked pine cone bursting with seeds. And next to it, something wholly out of place in the wild, his ranger badge. It hadn't fallen there. It had been placed. Carefully, deliberately, with reverence. Luke froze, as if he'd brushed a flame. The air thickened, holy, wordless, but clear in his chest. Then, from the forest's edge, a shadow stirred. The mother bear stepped into view, her fur silvered now around the muzzle, her pace slower, more dignified. No longer the wary creature from before, but something calmer, wiser. She didn't approach. She simply stood there, watching. No threat, no fear, only presence. Luke stood still, his heartbeat slowing to match the rhythm of the forest. And finally, he did the only thing that felt right. He knelt, bowed his head, and whispered, "Thank you." She blinked once, then turned, vanishing once more into the woods like she'd never been there at all. What do you do when nature sends you a sign? When a wild creature doesn't look at you with instinct, but with trust? If this story made you pause, reflect, or feel something you can't quite name, subscribe, hit like, and share it with someone who still believes in the bond between humans and the wild.
The scratching came first, quiet, uneven, almost hesitant. Lieutenant Ben Harlow blinked at the station door, unsure if he was imagining things. It was 4:47 a.m. in Autumn Ridge, and Firehouse 27 was dead quiet. The kind of quiet that made even the creak of a chair sound like thunder. Maya Brooks, the youngest firefighter on shift, was half asleep across the table, nursing a cup of stale coffee. She lifted her head, eyes heavy. "You hear that?" Ben asked, already moving toward the front. "Hear what?" "That." He pointed. The scratching again, more insistent this time. And then a whine, low, raw. It was the sound of something not just hurting, but pleading. Ben unlocked the heavy door and pulled it open. The outside light buzzed, casting a dim amber glow across the concrete step. And there, standing on trembling legs, was a German shepherd, matted, limping, and panting hard. Ben's breath caught. Not because of the dog's condition, although its ribs showed through its muddy coat and blood smeared its right paw, but because of what was in its mouth. A child's sneaker. White, with a faded pink stripe, and laces knotted tightly. Drenched in blood. The dog dropped it at his boots, then looked up and barked. Just once. Sharp. Urgent. Maya was beside him now, silent. Her hand went to her chest, eyes locked on the sneaker. "Jesus," she whispered. Ben crouched. The sneaker was small, maybe a kid's size 4. There was no mistaking the thick, dark stains on the toe. "This isn't random," he muttered. "It's like—" He trailed off, staring into the dog's eyes. They were wild, but not lost. Focused. Desperate. "It wants us to follow," Maya said softly. "Ben, look at its face." The dog had already turned, limping down the steps, pausing just long enough to glance back. Ben grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Engine 27. We're heading into the woods behind Mill Creek Road. Unconfirmed situation. We'll report status." He looked at Maya. "Grab the med bag." "You sure about this?" Ben's jaw clenched. But that dog didn't drag a bloody shoe here for fun. They loaded up the old forest response truck. The dog, against every regulation they had, leapt into the cab and sat in the passenger seat, shivering but alert, eyes fixed forward. It didn't make a sound for the entire 10-minute ride. The town gave way to treeline quickly. The farther they drove, the more overgrown the road became. Mill Creek had been closed for years, ever since the wildfire. The forest beyond was a graveyard. Charred trunks, twisted stumps, forgotten trails. No one went there anymore. At the end of the path, the dog jumped down and took off into the woods. "You've got to be kidding," Maya muttered, shouldering the med kit. Ben followed without a word. It was eerie. Quiet in that way the forest sometimes is, where even the birds feel like they're holding their breath. They followed the dog for about a quarter mile. Twigs snapping underfoot, fog hugging the ground. Then it stopped. A small clearing, barely visible, and in the center, partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves and broken limbs, something moved. Ben rushed forward and dropped to his knees, brushing the debris away. A hand. Pale. Scratched. Trembling. "Help," came a whisper, so faint he thought he'd imagined it. Maya was already on the radio. "Dispatch, this is Firehouse 27. We have a female, approximately early 20s, found semi-conscious, head trauma, possible exposure. Requesting EMS backup ASAP. We are 2 miles southeast of Mill Creek burn line. Coordinates coming." Ben eased the woman onto her side. Her face was bloodied, a deep gash above her eyebrow caked in dirt. Her lips were cracked from cold and dehydration. "Ma'am," he said gently, "can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. "Please." "There's another one." Ben froze. "Another what?" "A child. Deeper in—" She started to sob weakly. Maya's eyes met his. "Ben." He didn't speak. He turned to the dog. It was already staring back at them, its ears perked, tail twitching. No bark this time, just a look that said, "We're not done yet." The medics arrived just as the woman slipped back into unconsciousness. Maya gave a quick briefing before turning to Ben. "You're thinking what I'm thinking." Ben nodded. "We keep going." He picked up the flashlight from his belt, checked his radio. Dead. Too far out. Maya adjusted her pack. Following a wounded stray dog into a burned forest looking for a possibly abducted kid. "We're really doing this?" Ben gave her a tired half-smile. "That shoe didn't walk itself to our door." They plunged back into the woods, the German shepherd leading the way, limping still, but with purpose. Like it was retracing steps it knew by heart. The ground turned soft with moss. Every so often Ben spotted a small disturbance. A snapped branch, a smear of mud. Evidence of something, or someone, being dragged. "Who the hell is this dog?" Maya whispered at one point. Ben didn't answer. He had the same question. An hour passed, then 2. And just when they thought they'd lost the trail entirely, the dog stopped again. Dead still, nose in the air. Ben stepped up beside it. There, ahead in the low morning light, was the outline of something large and crooked. A structure, slouched against the trees. "What is that?" Maya murmured. Ben squinted. "An old shack?" The dog growled. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't fear. It was warning. He looked back at Maya. "You ready?" "No," she said. "But let's go anyway." They hadn't even opened the door yet, and both of them could feel it. The shift. Like the forest itself was holding its breath again. Whatever waited beyond that shack door, one thing was certain. This was far from over. 3 days earlier. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees in Autumn Ridge, casting long shadows over the backyard of the Sanders home. Lila Sanders stood at the kitchen sink, humming softly as she rinsed off a cutting board. From the window, she could see her daughter, Emily, twirling in the golden light. Her stuffed Dalmatian, Toby, clutched in one hand, spinning with her. The girl's laugh floated through the glass. Lila smiled and turned toward the stove. Dinner could wait 5 more minutes. She barely made it to the hallway when the phone rang. Her sister, Dana, calling from Idaho. Lila hesitated, glancing toward the window again. Emily was fine. Just a quick chat. 4 minutes later, when Lila returned, the yard was empty. The stuffed toy lay abandoned in the grass. The gate was ajar. Her scream cracked the air like a thunderclap. Back in the forest, present day. The shack was old, rotting. The door creaked on its hinges as Ben pushed it open, releasing a waft of mildew, rust, and something sourer. The German shepherd sat outside the threshold, refusing to step in. Inside, Maya swept her flashlight across the room. Dust danced in the beams of light. The space was small, just one room. No furniture except a metal chair bolted to the floor, a bucket in the corner, and something else. Jesus, Maya whispered. On the ground lay a coiled rope, darkened with old stains. Near it, a blue sneaker, small, child-sized. Cartoon print faded on the side. Blood smeared across the toe. Ben crouched, lifting the sneaker gently. Same style as the one the dog brought us. This one's smaller. Maya's stomach twisted. It's a girl's. Ben nodded grimly. We're looking for a kid. The dog let out a low growl. Its ears perked. It was staring behind the shack, into the dark trees. You hear something? Maya asked. Ben held up a hand for silence. Then, a twig snapped. Both turned toward the sound, but it was already gone. Silence returned, heavy and unnatural. Let's not stick around, Ben said, tightening his grip on the flashlight. This place feels wrong. Back outside, the shepherd had already moved to the side of the structure. Its nose was to the ground, tracing something invisible. Maya adjusted the radio on her vest. Still nothing. We're in a black zone, Ben muttered. Too deep. They followed the dog again, moving deeper into the forest. Ben glanced at the shack once more before turning away. Whatever had happened in there wasn't the end of the story. Just another echo of something darker. Later that night, as they paused for water near a dry creek bed, Maya sat back against a rock and stared at the stars flickering through the branches. You know, she said quietly, my uncle used to talk about this dog. Ben looked up. He worked at the town's animal control center years ago. Said a German shepherd escaped during a domestic disturbance. Belonged to a woman named Rachel. She'd reported her boyfriend, some nutjob ex with a record. But before they could act, both the dog and the woman disappeared. Ben raised an eyebrow. No follow-up? Just blood on the trail behind their place. They searched for weeks. Nothing. They thought she ran. Said the dog probably died out there. Ben glanced at the animal resting a few feet away, still breathing hard, still refusing to quit. You think this is that dog? I don't know, Maya said. But if it is, he's been out here for years. Ben exhaled slowly, watching the dog twitch in his sleep. Waiting for someone to listen. Flashback. 72 hours earlier. Emily had always been bright, full of questions, curious about everything. She didn't talk to strangers. Lila made sure of that. But the man wasn't a stranger, at least not entirely. He said he'd met Lila at the store. Said he had puppies. He was nice, soft-spoken. He knew her name. Emily followed him only to the gate. Then, when she hesitated, he smiled and held up something, a stuffed Dalmatian. It looked just like Toby. That was the last thing she remembered before the world went dark. Back in the present. The trail twisted through a thick stand of pines. Branches clawed at their jackets. The dog stopped abruptly and barked, once, then moved again. They reached a narrow gully where something hung from a branch. Maya climbed up first and unhooked the fabric. It was a child's sweater. Torn. Drenched in morning dew. And something darker. Jesus, she whispered. Pink, cartoon rabbits. Ben, this is fresh. He nodded, jaw tight. We're getting closer. Suddenly the dog let out a low rumble. Its ears turned toward the west. It began walking, limping still, but faster. Maya followed. They crested a small ridge. Below, half hidden in the overgrowth, stood another structure, much smaller. Not a cabin, not even a shack. A storage shed. Rusted roof. Padlock busted. Was this even on the map? Maya asked. Nope, Ben said, stepping carefully. Inside, it was empty except for a torn sleeping bag, food wrappers, and a name scratched into the wall. Emily. Ben, Maya called from the corner. She held something up. It was a photograph, folded, wrinkled. A woman smiling with a German shepherd. On the back, me and Axel, always together. Love, Rachel. Ben stared. It's her. Which means the dog. He's Axel. Maya knelt next to him. She trusted him. She must have died nearby, and he stayed. Ben didn't respond. He looked at Axel, who stood at the threshold of the shed, tail low, watching the forest like it might breathe. As night fell, the air turned colder. Maya checked her watch. We've been out here almost 15 hours. Ben rubbed his eyes. We keep going. We're close. They sat in silence for a moment, the woods pressing in around them. Then Maya asked, almost to herself, You think a dog could really remember? Ben looked at Axel, who hadn't slept since they started. I think he never forgot. A gust of wind rolled through the trees, carrying with it a distant sound, like movement. A shuffle. Something human. Axel stood, eyes fixed on the darkness. Ben stood too. Let's move. And just like that, they were running again. After a dog who had already seen too much but wasn't done yet. The trail narrowed into a trench of gnarled roots and brambles. The deeper they went, the quieter it got. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the steady crunch of boots on cold earth and the uneven shuffle of Axel's paws ahead. The forest seemed to pull in around them, shadows thickening with every step. Maya wiped a line of sweat from her brow despite the cold. It's like this place doesn't want to be found. Ben didn't answer. He was focused on the German shepherd, who limped forward with unwavering precision. The dog didn't pause, didn't hesitate. It moved like it knew exactly where it was going, like it had walked this path 100 times before, in dreams, in memory, or both. Suddenly Axel stopped. Ben froze mid-step. What is it? The dog's ears were forward, nose twitching. Then, as if making a decision, Axel turned sharply to the left and began pushing through dense underbrush. They followed, branches clawing at their jackets. Maya winced as a thorn caught her forearm. Then came the ridge, a steep slope, overgrown and slick with moss. Axel bounded down without warning. Ben muttered, "Here we go," and started after him. Halfway down, he heard Maya slip. He turned in time to see her flailing, boots sliding on the loose earth. Hold on! But it wasn't Ben who caught her. Axel, somehow faster despite his limp, latched onto the back of Maya's jacket with his teeth. He didn't pull hard, just enough to slow her fall and steady her footing. She landed with a grunt and turned in disbelief. The dog let go and stepped back, panting. "You just saved my ass," she whispered. Ben helped her up. "You good?" She nodded, staring at Axel. "Yeah, thanks to him." The ravine opened into a narrow clearing, barely wider than a living room. A circle of broken trees surrounded it, the ground flat and cleared in a way that felt unnatural. Axel stopped at the edge. Then, slowly, his head lowered. His body tensed. Ben followed his gaze. There, beneath a twisted elm, was a girl. She was tied to the base of the tree with frayed rope, her knees scraped and bleeding, her small frame trembling. She couldn't have been older than 8. Her socks were mismatched, her jeans torn. Her face was dirty, her eyes wide with terror. "Emily." Maya gasped. And standing over her, his back turned, hands twitching at his sides, was a man in a gray hoodie. Travis Knox. Ben saw the blade in his right hand before he saw the madness in his eyes. "Drop the knife!" Ben shouted, drawing his service weapon. The man didn't turn. His voice was low, muttering. "She said someone would come. I told her the dog remembers. They never believed me. But she knew. Hands where I can see them, Ben barked. Travis turned slowly, his expression blank. His eyes, those were not the eyes of a sane man. They were flat, distant. He wasn't here, not fully. He looked at the gun, then at Axel, and he smiled. You remember me, don't you, boy? Axel's growl started low, deep in his chest, and rose with each second. Then he lunged. It was a blur of fur and fury. The German shepherd hit Travis square in the chest, knocking him back. The knife flew from his hand and skittered across the dirt. Go! Ben yelled. Maya was already moving. She dropped to her knees beside Emily, sawing through the ropes with her rescue blade. You're okay now, sweetheart, she said, her voice trembling. You're safe. The girl didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just clung to Maya, her tiny hands gripping the firefighter's coat with white-knuckled desperation. Axel stood over Travis, teeth bared, growling low. The man writhed beneath him, groaning. Ben kicked the knife away and slammed a knee into Travis's back. You're done, he growled, snapping the cuffs tight. You're done hurting anyone else. Maya scooped Emily into her arms. The girl pressed her face into Maya's chest, silent tears soaking through her uniform. Axel limped over and rested his head against Emily's side. She looked down at him. Her fingers, still trembling, reached out and touched his muzzle. He said the dog would come, she whispered. He promised me. Ben's heart clenched. He turned toward Maya. Get her out of here. Radio for evac. Already did. They're 5 minutes out. Ben hauled Travis to his feet. You're going to rot for this. But the man just chuckled. She wasn't the first, you know, he said. She was just the last one who looked like her. Ben shoved him toward a tree and forced him down. Don't talk. Maya wrapped Emily in a thermal blanket from her pack. The girl didn't speak again, just stared at the dog who lay beside her, tail twitching faintly. When the paramedics arrived, they took Travis into custody and loaded Emily into the back of the ambulance. She gripped Axel's collar until the very last second, when the paramedic gently guided her hand away. Axel tried to jump in after her. Maya stopped him. It's okay, she said, kneeling. You did it. The dog's eyes locked on hers, tired, wild, but somehow calm. He's not just a stray, she whispered. He's a soldier. Ben stood beside her, arms crossed. He remembered. Maya nodded. And because of that, she's alive. The ambulance doors shut with a heavy click. As the lights faded into the trees, Axel turned and looked back into the forest. Not with fear, with unfinished business. The crime scene tape fluttered weakly in the morning breeze, stretched across the clearing like a barrier between the living and the unspeakable. Ben stood just beyond it, arms folded, jaw clenched, watching as a team of forensic techs worked in near silence. Behind them, 2 sheriff's deputies guarded the entrance to the ravine, where it had all unraveled the night before. Travis Knox had been taken into custody without resistance after the attack. If anything, he'd seemed eerily satisfied, like something inevitable had finally happened. He told me someone would come for her, Emily had whispered in the ambulance, that the forest would help, that the dog remembered. At the time, it hadn't made much sense. But now, as Ben stared down at the patch of disturbed earth near the tree line, ropes, tattered cloth, a woman's shoe half buried in dirt, it all began to align. Emily had survived, but someone else hadn't. They found the bones at dawn, buried shallow beneath an uprooted pine, less than 40 feet from where Emily had been tied. What was left of the body had been wrapped in a faded blue sweater, the kind sold at roadside thrift shops, and tucked gently into a fetal position. Like someone had cared, even if only for a moment. It was Maya who uncovered the first sign, a scrap of leather with a tarnished dog tag buried beside the remains. She picked it up carefully, brushing away the dirt. The name engraved on the worn metal read, Axel. She turned to Ben, her voice hoarse. It's his. Ben took the tag, eyes scanning the curve of the letters. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. They confirmed the identity 2 days later. Rachel Knox, 33. Missing for over 5 years. Reported last seen arguing with her ex-boyfriend Travis on the porch of a rundown cabin 10 miles outside Autumn Ridge. At the time, she'd been dismissed as a runaway. No body, no forced entry, just a trail of blood behind the cabin, and a missing dog. The file had gathered dust in a drawer. Another cold case, another forgotten woman, but not forgotten by everyone. Back at the firehouse, Axel lay curled on a thick blanket by the engine bay door, his head resting on his good paw, the other bandaged. He hadn't moved much since they'd returned. Wouldn't eat. Barely drank. Maya sat beside him now, holding the dog tag in her hand. She'd cleaned it, strung it on a thin cord, and looped it gently around his neck. "You stayed," she murmured. "All this time, you stayed." The dog didn't lift his head, but his tail thumped once. Ben entered, holding a manila folder. They found something else. Maya looked up. What? Animal control record, from 5 years ago. Apparently, Axel was scheduled for evaluation after failing his final K9 obedience exam. They said he was too headstrong, too independent. She snorted. That's one way of putting it. They listed him as a potential therapy dog. Rachel adopted him the next month. Maya's voice lowered, and then disappeared. Ben nodded. Travis was brought in for questioning, but they didn't have enough. No witnesses, no physical evidence. He moved towns within a year, changed his name in a neighboring county, laid low until he took Emily. Ben walked over to Axel and crouched. "You tried to tell us back then, didn't you?" The shepherd didn't respond, just blinked slowly. Maya sighed. "You know what this means, right? That dog led us back to the body of his owner after 5 years. No tracking collar, no training orders, nothing but memory." Ben stood. He didn't stay because he was lost. He stayed because she was. That afternoon, Emily returned to the firehouse with her mother. She was still pale, still quiet, but her eyes lit up the moment she saw the dog. Axel lifted his head, then slowly, achingly, got to his feet. The girl ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "I knew you'd come," she whispered. Her mother knelt beside them, tears streaking her cheeks. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Axel nuzzled Emily gently, then settled beside her, content to simply be close. Ben watched from a distance, a lump in his throat. He turned to Maya. "She said something in the ambulance. Emily, about Travis." "Yeah?" "She said he kept talking to himself. Said she reminded him of someone. That the dog would remember." Maya's brow furrowed. "So he knew Axel would come?" Ben nodded. "I think he wanted him to." "Why?" "I don't know. Maybe guilt. Maybe madness. Maybe he knew he didn't bury everything as deep as he thought." The town reacted quickly. The sheriff reopened Rachel's case. Travis Knox was officially charged not only with Emily's abduction and attempted murder, but now, second-degree homicide for Rachel's death. The DA moved fast. No jury was likely to look kindly on a man who'd tied an 8-year-old to a tree and left her in the dark. Travis showed no emotion in his arraignment, no remorse. He just sat there, blank and distant, eyes half-lidded, as though waiting for a sentence he'd already handed himself years ago. But outside the courtroom, something else was happening. A different kind of justice. Axel's story had spread. On the 5th night after Emily's rescue, candles lined the sidewalk outside Firehouse 27. Handwritten notes, small shoes, drawings of dogs. One child had left a folded piece of paper with crayon lettering that read, "You didn't forget, so we won't either." Inside, Maya clipped the original dog tag to a bulletin board in the engine bay. Above it, she pinned a photo of Rachel, smiling, arm draped around a younger Axel in front of a forest trail. Ben joined her, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. "He's not sleeping well," she said. "Neither am I," he admitted. "I keep thinking about it. How many nights did he lie out there, waiting, watching?" Ben looked over at Axel, who was curled up again by the garage door, facing the trees beyond. "I think," Ben said softly, "he never left, because part of him was still with her. Back there." Maya nodded. "The place he never left." They stood in silence for a long time. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and just beyond the fence, Axel opened his eyes and watched. Still, waiting, remembering. The ceremony was quiet, but the emotion in the air was anything but. A modest crowd had gathered in the town square of Autumn Ridge. Neighbors, firefighters, teachers, even strangers who had followed the story from nearby counties. The mayor stood behind a wooden podium, his voice warm but solemn. "We are here not only to honor a rescue," he said, "but a resilience. Not just of a child, but of something that goes beyond training, beyond instinct. Something we all hope to recognize someday in ourselves. Loyalty without condition. Courage without command." Behind him, a makeshift banner stretched across the firehouse wall. Axel, the dog who remembered. Ben stood just off to the side with Maya, both in their station jackets. And in front of them sat Axel, his coat now clean, his eyes alert but soft. A small custom vest had been fitted to his chest, the firehouse's emblem stitched on one side. A boy in the crowd whispered, "That's him," and a hush fell over the group. Emily stepped forward, her little hand holding tightly to a folded piece of paper. She wore a pale yellow dress and a red scarf that fluttered gently in the wind. The same scarf Axel had once tugged playfully during their first walk after the rescue. The girl looked up at the crowd, then down at Axel, then unfolded the note. "Dear Axel," she began softly, "thank you for finding me, for not giving up, for remembering when everyone else forgot." She turned and knelt beside him, slipping a ribboned medal from a small box and gently looping it around his neck. "You're my hero," she whispered, then pressed her forehead to his. The crowd clapped, but not loudly. It was the kind of applause that's born from reverence, not celebration. Ben stepped up to the mic next. "He didn't bark for attention," he said. "He barked for justice. And when no one listened the first time, he came back anyway. For 5 years this dog lived alone in a forest because he refused to forget." He paused, then added, "That's more than loyalty. That's love." Axel didn't care for crowds, and he didn't stay long. That night, after the last guest had gone home and the firehouse lights dimmed, he curled up in his usual spot by the bay door. Maya found him there and sat down beside him, 2 mugs of cocoa in her hands. She didn't say much, just sipped quietly and looked out into the dark. "You're not a stray anymore," she finally said. "You're family now." Axel's tail thumped once. Over the following weeks, Autumn Ridge slowly returned to its rhythms, but something subtle had shifted. People walked their dogs a little farther, looked their neighbors in the eye a little longer. Kids stopped by the firehouse on Saturdays just to peek in and maybe catch a glimpse of the hero dog. The firehouse turned an old supply room into Axel's corner, complete with a cot, a window, and a plaque that read, "Axel, the one who remembered." Emily visited often, always with a new drawing tucked in her backpack. Her parents said she was smiling more now, laughing again, sleeping through the night. One of her drawings showed Axel standing in front of a dark forest, tail raised, blocking the path like a guardian. She titled it, "The Dog Who Waited for the Wind to Change." It was a Sunday morning in late November when something changed. Maya arrived early, as always, to check on him. But Axel wasn't waiting at the door. His blanket was untouched. She found him instead at the tree line just behind the station, sitting quietly, gazing into the woods like he used to. The sun had barely risen, but the sky glowed faintly pink. Maya crouched beside him, resting a hand on his back. "You thinking about her?" she asked. He didn't move. "You don't have to stay anymore, you know. You've done more than enough." Axel turned his head slowly. Then, almost imperceptibly, he leaned his weight into her hand just for a moment. And then he stood, limped gently back to the station door, and lay down. 3 weeks later, the first snow fell. The crew found him curled in his bed that morning, his breathing soft and deep. Peaceful. He didn't wake when they called his name. Didn't twitch at the sound of boots or the clang of the engine bay door. Maya touched his side gently. Still warm. Still whole. But gone. Ben knelt beside her, eyes stinging. He waited until she was okay, he said quietly. Until we all were, Maya added. They buried Axel at the edge of the woods, beneath a tall pine that overlooked the trail he'd walked so many times. A simple stone marker read, Axel, the one who returned. The one who remained. Emily laid the red scarf across the grave. She didn't cry. She stood tall and whispered, Thank you for remembering me. I'll remember you too. A month later, the town opened Memory Grove, a park built where the woods once carried only fear. At its heart was a bench beneath that pine tree. Children came to read, to draw, to sit quietly. One trail, Axel's trail, led into the trees, marked by paw prints carved into the stones. It didn't lead anywhere specific, just forward. The video of Axel's ceremony, filmed by a firefighter's teenage son, went viral within days. No fancy editing, no music, just a clip of Emily placing the medal around Axel's neck and whispering, You found me. The internet responded in waves. Axel the hero dog trended for weeks. Letters poured in from across the country. Parents wrote to say their children weren't afraid of dogs anymore. Veterans said Axel reminded them of their own partners long gone. A shelter in Maine renamed its adoption center Axel's House. But the story that stayed with Maya the most came in the form of a letter. Handwritten, simple. 42 years on the force. I've known brave men, brave dogs, but never one who led us not with his teeth or his training, but with his heart. Axel remembered what we tried to forget, and that made all the difference. R. Dalton, retired deputy sheriff, Tennessee. Sometimes Maya still wakes early and walks to the edge of the tree line. She sits on the bench and listens to the wind in the branches. And she swears sometimes when the morning is quiet enough. She hears a soft thump in the leaves behind her, like a tail, wagging, waiting, remembering.